In 2025, Canada finds itself caught in the crosshairs of a geopolitical storm, one brewing not across oceans, but just south of the border. The architect, Donald J. Trump. Since his dramatic return to the White House, Trump has unleashed a series of moves that experts warn could unravel the very foundations of Canada's economy, diplomacy, and national identity. Since his return to the White House, Trump hasn't just reignited old tensions. He's declared a silent, strategic war on America's oldest ally. But this isn't some diplomatic spat or a trade scuffle. No, this is calculated demolition. From crippling tariffs that are choking Canadian industries, to covert intelligence blackouts that isolate Ottawa from Five Eyes, to cyber offensives designed to fracture trust and cause chaos. Trump's 2025 agenda is not just about America first. It's about Canada last. And here's the chilling part. Most Canadians don't even see it coming. So in today's video, we are going to show you 10 Trump shocking moves that could kill Canada in 2025. Let's start. Number 10. The tariff tsunami crippling Canada's trade lifeline. The first wave of Trump's economic assault began in March 2025, when the administration implemented sweeping tariffs on Canadian exports, 25% on steel, 20% on lumber, and 10% on all clean energy products. These were not symbolic gestures. Within 90 days, Canada's trade surplus with the U.S. plummeted. Ontario's steel industry, a $15 billion sector, reported its worst quarter in 2 decades. Thousands of workers across British Columbia and Quebec were laid off. Groceries in Canadian supermarkets skyrocketed due to increased costs in imported agricultural tools and machinery. Trump justified these actions under the guise of economic fairness, claiming that Canada had manipulated trade and benefited from U.S. military protection without paying its share. But economists quickly saw through the rhetoric. The World Trade Organization called the move unprecedented. And within weeks, Canada's GDP growth projections were slashed by 2.1%. Consumer confidence tanked. Canadian families began pulling savings from banks. The Toronto Stock Exchange shed over 8% in a single week. And whispers of recession turned into full-blown panic as foreign investors began to flee the country. National unemployment surged past 8.4%, the highest since the 2008 global crash. Small businesses reported a 41% decline in revenue. And in a chilling forecast, the Bank of Canada warned that without U.S. cooperation, Canada could face a prolonged stagflation crisis by early 2026. Number 9. The Canadian dollar crisis, a currency in free fall. Following the tariff announcements, investor confidence in the Canadian economy nosedived. The Canadian dollar, once stable at $0.73, dropped to a historic low of 59 cents by mid-June. The crash triggered immediate inflation, with imports becoming dramatically more expensive. For ordinary Canadians, this meant higher fuel costs, spiking mortgage interest rates, and a rapidly increasing cost of living. International banks began withdrawing investments. Pension funds lost billions in valuation. The Bank of Canada was forced into emergency interest rate hikes, pushing the nation perilously close to stagflation. Trump capitalized on this turmoil, publicly mocking the toilet paper loonie and suggesting that Canada's economy was collapsing under its own weight. In Toronto and Vancouver, housing markets froze overnight, buyers vanished, and home values plunged by up to 17% in just 6 weeks. Nationwide, food banks reported a 60% surge in demand as middle-class families slipped into poverty. The loonies' crash also paralyzed cross-border travel, with Canadians canceling U.S. trips en masse. Financial experts warned, if the currency slipped below 55 cents, a full-scale banking crisis could erupt. Number 8. Border shutdowns, choking Canada's economic arteries. In April, Trump's administration enacted partial closures of 5 major U.S.-Canada border crossings under the justification of national security concerns. The result was chaos. Commercial truck delays lasted up to 36 hours, and cross-border tourism effectively ceased. Niagara Falls, a hub for U.S. visitors, reported a 70% drop in revenue. Vancouver's international businesses, already strained, began to fold under the pressure. With over $1.7 billion in daily trade flowing across the border, even a partial disruption sent shockwaves through Canadian logistics. Auto plants in Windsor were forced to halt production due to parts shortages. Farmers couldn't export perishables in time, leading to mass spoilage and financial losses. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce called it the most destructive border policy in modern history. Within days, grocery store shelves in parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan were eerily empty. Pharmaceutical deliveries were delayed, triggering dangerous shortages of critical medications like insulin and heart drugs. Trucking companies began laying off staff en masse as freight demand collapsed. At Pearson International Airport, cargo backups caused over $40 million in delays in a single week. Panic buying erupted in Montreal, where fuel supplies ran dangerously low. By May, small towns near the border declared local economic emergencies. And behind closed doors, Canadian officials began drafting worst-case contingency plans in case Trump ordered a full border lockdown. Canadian Border Services reported a 300% increase in attempted illegal crossings by desperate workers trying to reach U.S. jobs. Major hospitals in Ontario warned of upcoming surgery cancellations due to dwindling medical supplies. The tourism industry projected over $12 billion in summer losses, a crippling blow for cities already reeling. And in a chilling twist, leaked U.S. intelligence suggested that the closures weren't temporary at all, but part of a calculated long-term strategy to economically suffocate Canada's border-dependent regions. Number 7. Targeting Canadian energy, Alberta in crisis. Trump's next move struck at Canada's energy core. In May, he unilaterally banned the import of Canadian oil into 8 U.S. states, citing environmental and security issues. Alberta, which exports nearly 80% of its oil to the U.S., immediately faced a $10 billion revenue shortfall. Oil sands operations were halted. Tens of thousands of energy jobs vanished. Premier Danielle Smith called the move an economic death sentence for Alberta. Even worse, U.S. refineries began sourcing oil from Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, cutting Canada out of its most vital market. Trump publicly gloated at a rally, declaring, "America doesn't need Canada's dirty oil. We've got better deals now." Within 3 weeks, over 60% of Alberta's active oil rigs were shut down. Small towns built around energy collapsed into sudden unemployment, with food banks in Fort McMurray and Red Deer overwhelmed by demand. Western Canadian select crude prices plunged to $32 a barrel, triggering mass layoffs across Calgary's corporate energy sector. Protesters flooded provincial legislatures demanding federal intervention, but Ottawa had no leverage against Washington's unilateral energy blockade. Pipeline companies like Enbridge and TC Energy lost billions in valuation almost overnight. Credit agencies slashed Alberta's credit rating to near-junk status. And in a shocking escalation, Trump hinted at placing sanctions on Canadian oil tech firms supplying components to Europe, signaling a broader campaign to isolate Canada from global energy markets. Analysts began warning that Alberta could become Canada's first economic collapse zone if U.S. restrictions remained in place into 2026. Number 6. Assault on Canadian banking, freezing financial links. In June, Trump weaponized the financial system. The U.S. Treasury announced new regulations scrutinizing Canadian financial institutions operating in the U.S. TD Bank, RBC, and Scotiabank, all with major U.S. footprints, saw share prices plummet. Cross-border transfers were delayed. Clients withdrew billions amid uncertainty. The Toronto Stock Exchange suffered its largest single-day drop since 2008. Canadian venture capital dried up as American investors pulled out. Credit rating agencies issued negative outlooks for Canada's financial future. The result? A full-blown liquidity crisis. Over $230 billion in Canadian assets were suddenly frozen or tied up in regulatory limbo. Mortgage approvals collapsed by 47% nationwide. Bay Street, Canada's financial heart, turned into a panic zone. Executives were seen walking out of towers with boxes. RBC lost nearly $18 billion in market cap in just 5 trading sessions. TD was forced to pause its U.S. expansion projects, laying off over 3,000 employees. The Bank of Canada issued back-to-back emergency liquidity injections totaling $95 billion in under 2 weeks, an unprecedented bailout move. ATMs in some cities ran out of cash as frightened citizens rushed to withdraw savings. Small business loans were halted. And in the most disturbing sign yet, rumors emerged that the U.S. was considering cutting off Canadian banks from the SWIFT international payment system, essentially erasing Canada from the global financial map. Foreign banks began divesting from Canada at record speed, with Deutsche Bank and HSBC quietly exiting key markets. Housing prices in Toronto and Vancouver dropped another 12% as credit evaporated and panic set in. Pension funds were hit hard, losing up to 22% of their value, threatening retirements for millions. And in a chilling internal memo leaked to the press, Canadian finance officials warned of a potential systemic banking failure if U.S. pressure continued into the fall. Number 5. Kicking Canada out of Five Eyes, a strategic isolation. Perhaps the most chilling geopolitical move came in July. Trump hinted that Canada should be suspended from the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, citing its unreliable stance on China and weak cybersecurity protections. While no formal expulsion has occurred, intelligence sharing has slowed, and U.S. agencies have begun excluding Canada from key briefings. This isolation has enormous consequences. Canada's intelligence agencies are now operating blind in an era of digital warfare and global instability. NATO allies are reportedly concerned, with some even questioning Canada's readiness for modern conflicts. Trump's message is clear: fall in line or fall out. Within days, Canadian cyber defense teams were locked out of joint simulations and encrypted communication channels. The Communications Security Establishment issued an emergency alert to Parliament, warning of a severe decline in foreign threat visibility. Ottawa was reportedly blindsided by a North Korean missile test, information it would have typically received via U.S. intelligence pipelines. Chinese hackers, sensing vulnerability, launched a wave of coordinated cyber attacks on Canadian government servers, breaching 2 federal departments and exposing sensitive personnel files. Meanwhile, Canadian airports and seaports reported increased probing by foreign surveillance drones, signals of a nation being digitally tested. Behind closed doors, SIS officials admitted they were flying blind. Canada was now forced to rely on slower, second-hand intelligence from European allies. Military analysts warned that Canada's exclusion from Five Eyes would cripple its battlefield awareness in any global conflict. To make matters worse, a leaked Pentagon memo labeled Canada as a secondary strategic partner, a stunning downgrade that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. The public didn't even need confirmation. The silence from Washington said it all. Canada, once seen as America's closest ally, was now treated like a liability. Number 4. Digital warfare, crushing Canada's tech ambitions. Canada's decision to introduce a digital services tax targeting U.S. tech giants like Google and Meta was met with brutal retaliation. Trump imposed retaliatory tariffs, restricted Canadian app access in the U.S., and suspended several Canadian cloud contracts with U.S. federal agencies. Toronto's startup scene, once dubbed Silicon Valley North, is in free fall. Tech investment fell by 45% in Q2. Innovation hubs in Montreal and Vancouver are reporting mass layoffs. Within weeks, over 1,800 Canadian tech startups reported critical funding freezes. Major venture capital firms from Silicon Valley pulled out of Canadian markets entirely. Shopify's valuation dropped by 38% as U.S. customer access declined. Ottawa's ambitious AI development initiative was quietly shelved after Amazon Web Services suspended cooperation. Google responded by halting ad revenue payments to several Canadian publishers. Meta delisted hundreds of Canadian pages from U.S. search visibility, cutting off millions of potential users. Even Canadian educational institutions felt the ripple. Students were blocked from accessing premium tools hosted on U.S. platforms. A confidential report from the Canadian Digital Policy Council warned that the country could lose a generation of innovation if U.S. tech sanctions persisted. Job boards in Vancouver's tech corridor saw a 61% drop in postings. The tech brain drain began accelerating, with top engineers migrating to U.S. firms. And for the first time in 2 decades, Canada fell out of the global top 20 innovation rankings. Number 3, weaponizing immigration, refugees, and residency in limbo. In August, the Trump administration froze visa processing for Canadian students and skilled workers. Additionally, new rules were introduced that complicated dual citizenship and cross-border residency for Canadians in the U.S. This caused panic among families, businesses, and academic institutions. Thousands of Canadians who live or work in the U.S. faced sudden legal uncertainty. Universities saw a sharp decline in Canadian enrollments. Cross-border marriages were thrown into chaos. Human rights groups called the policy discriminatory. Trump remained unapologetic, stating that America must look after Americans first. Within 48 hours, over 12,000 visa applications were placed on indefinite hold. Canadian nurses, engineers, and software developers working in the U.S. were told to leave within 30 days or face deportation. Major U.S. hospitals in Michigan and New York reported staffing shortages as hundreds of Canadian healthcare workers were forced out. Elite schools like Harvard, Stanford, and MIT reported a 53% drop in Canadian student admissions. Families separated across the border scrambled to hire immigration attorneys, many paying upwards of $25,000 just to stay together. Dual citizens born in Canada suddenly found themselves flagged in Homeland Security databases. Canada's Minister of Immigration called the policy a deliberate attempt to destabilize the human and economic bridge between our two nations. But Washington didn't flinch. Instead, U.S. border agents began denying re-entry to Canadians who had previously held valid residency rights, stranding some families on vacation in Canada with no way back. Airlines reported a spike in one-way flights as panic spread among Canadian expats. Social media exploded with stories of students evicted from dorms, professionals fired overnight, and elderly parents trapped on one side of the border. Ottawa's emergency hotline received more than 110,000 calls in the first week alone. And still, Trump doubled down, calling it the beginning of a stronger, more sovereign America. Number 2, annexation rhetoric, the 51st state mockery. In a shocking speech, Trump joked that Canada would be better off as the 51st state. What some called a joke, others viewed as a thinly veiled threat. U.S. pundits and right-wing media began circulating the idea, fueling nationalist tensions in Canada. The rhetoric sparked protests across Canadian cities. Politicians condemned it as neo-imperialism. But Trump supporters took to social media in droves, flooding hashtags like #51STState and #MakeCanadaGreatAgain. For the first time in modern history, a U.S. president was openly entertaining the idea of absorbing a sovereign democratic nation. Within days, U.S.-based think tanks released feasibility reports on a Canada-U.S. unification, citing shared culture and economic synergy. Fox News aired a primetime special titled Canada, Wasted Potential, sparking outrage in Ottawa. Pro-Trump demonstrators staged a bizarre parade along the border, waving both American and Canadian flags while chanting Annexation now. Canadian intelligence services picked up signs of coordinated online influence campaigns, believed to originate from U.S. political operatives, spreading disinformation about Canada's constitutional instability. Quebec separatists, long dormant, saw a spike in new membership. Western Canadian provinces, frustrated by economic collapse, saw petitions emerge demanding referendums on joining the U.S. as autonomous states. Statues of Canadian founding figures were vandalized in several cities, tagged with slogans like America Saves and Join the Real North. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, pro-American rallies, once unthinkable, attracted thousands. Meanwhile, U.S. political influencers suggested that a peaceful annexation could solve Canada's failures in governance. Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered an emergency address, calling the remarks a direct threat to Canadian sovereignty and warning of foreign manipulation aimed at dismantling our national unity. But many feared it was already too late. The psychological warfare had begun. National polls showed a disturbing trend. Nearly 17% of Canadians under 35 said they'd support joining the U.S. if economic conditions worsened. Number 1, the Mexico shift, a North American alliance without Canada. Perhaps the most consequential move came quietly, behind closed doors. Trump's administration is reportedly pursuing a new North American partnership with Mexico, one that excludes Canada. The alliance would encompass trade, energy, and digital infrastructure. If successful, this would effectively sideline Canada from North America's strategic future. Economists warn that losing this trilateral footing would cost Canada up to $130 billion annually in lost trade and investment. Canada would be left isolated between two economic giants reshaping the continent without it. Even worse, Canada would lose automatic access to shared defense procurement systems, advanced AI defense projects, and critical chip supply chains now being diverted south. Global investors have already labeled Canada as a regional outlier. The IMF has downgraded its economic outlook, citing strategic detachment from continental integration. In essence, Canada is being erased from the blueprint of North America's next chapter. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.